For nearly an entire month, the third season of Kaguya-sama Love is War held the #1 spot on MyAnimeList, a spot usually reserved for Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, though usurpers to the throne have been a constant over the years. But that got me thinking, how many anime besides Brotherhood have held the #1 spot in all of MAL's history? And what was it about those shows that made them stand so tall above the rest? Well, that's what we're here to discuss today. So join me as I fall deep into the Wayback Machine and endlessly click on every single recorded date in MAL's history. This is gonna take a while. To find the earliest record of MAL's top anime list, we need to travel all the way back to November 7th, 2006, about 2 years after the site was founded. Yes, these early records are going to be a bit spotty, but it's all we have, so we're just gonna have to roll with it. Right off the bat, I just find it kind of hilarious that even before Brotherhood came along, the #1 spot was still held by Fullmetal Alchemist, this time the 2003 version, which honestly isn't that surprising if you actually remember that era. Brotherhood's popularity might have lasted longer due to it being a complete adaptation that's more faithful to the source, but 03 was fucking inescapable at the time, and this score was a genuine reflection of how people saw it. It really wasn't until we got Brotherhood that a lot more people started to take issue with 03's story. While this video will mostly focus just on the #1 spot over time, I do want to take a broader look at this set of rankings in particular because it just gets more and more fascinating the more you look at it. For perspective, this was about a month after Death Note started airing, and it's already at the #4 spot. So the next time you see someone complaining about a new seasonal anime immediately jumping into the super high ranks, remember that this has been a constant throughout MAL's entire history. Not that this isn't a valid complaint, but it's definitely not a new phenomenon. It's also very apropos that the shows in this 25 that have a higher score now than they did back then are ones that have garnered a reputation as classics, with shows like Cowboy Bebop, Mushishi, Berserk, and more populating this category. Though in terms of actual ranking, all of them are far lower than they ever were on this list, simply due to the fact that there are more anime in existence. Honestly, I could sit here and dissect these rankings all day. From the fact that both FMA and Hunter x Hunter still dominated on their initial anime runs, to the notion that there was a time when classics like Legend of the Galactic Heroes didn't even chart. But the last thing I want to draw attention to with this particular list is a phenomenon that will be fundamental to understanding MAL rankings going forward. And so we come to School Rumble, Honey and Clover, and their respective sequels. As you can see, both shows have their second seasons rated higher than their firsts. And while this might be due in part to those seasons actually being better, it's also due to a behavior that one might not often think about. Let's say, for example, that you didn't like the first season of School Rumble, and so you rate it on MAL accordingly. As such, you probably don't bother watching the second season, and therefore you have no reason to rate it. In contrast, someone who did like the first season and scored it accordingly will most likely stay on for the second season, and so they go on to rate that season as well. As a result, the lower scores that would have been applied to the second season no longer exist, and so its rating gets pushed higher by the fans who stuck around. Henceforth, I'll be referring to this phenomenon as the sequel effect. Instances where a second season is rated higher than the first, in large part because most of the people who stuck around for additional seasons are those who already liked it. And understanding that this phenomenon takes place is vital to understanding the history of MAL rankings, as the vast majority of #1 entries in a post-Brotherhood landscape are sequels. Moving forward to December 23rd, 2006, we already see a changing of the guard taking place, as Death Note rises to overtake FMA. Keep in mind that only 11 episodes of Death Note have been released by this point, and the number actually available with subtitles was probably even lower. Of course, in hindsight, it's really not that surprising. I mean, It's Death Note, one of the ultimate starter anime. It presents a unique and captivating concept right out of the gate, has an incredibly intelligent cast of characters, and constantly keeps the viewer on the edge of their seat. It's really no wonder at all why people immediately latched onto it. As its initial airing progressed, Death Note's score kept climbing higher and higher, and despite losing a bit of steam during its third core, it eventually peaked at an 8.97. And then, something unexpected happened. On July 16, 2007, Death Note was overtaken by Hajime no Ippo, a series that had been finished for almost 5 years at that point. And I can only assume the reason for this is that the fan subs started hitting the torrent circuit around this time. Considering that even to this day it's known as one of the best sports anime, I'm honestly not that surprised. However, it is also very prudent to note that MAL's user base was only a minute fraction of what it is today. When I say Hajime no Ippo was the #1 anime, I mean that 402 people put it in that spot, as compared to the just shy of 1,600 people who had rated Death Note. We're talking about extremely small number pools here. And when you're dealing with hundredths of a point, even a single 5 out of 10 could drastically alter who's at the top, as evidenced by Death Note reclaiming its spot within a month. Now, at this point in the video, I unfortunately have to admit that I inadvertently misled you just a bit. You see, during its early iterations, MAL did not have an all-anime ranking list. Everything was divided into TV series, movies, OVAs, and specials. And so we've only been looking at the TV series rankings so far. While Death Note was the #1 TV anime, the #1 anime overall, as of May 5th, 2007, was Rurouni Kenshin Trust and Betrayal, though at the time it was known as Rurouni Kenshin Reminiscence. In truth, it actually tied FMA's score a couple times before Death Note took over, but since MAL scores only go to the 100th place, it's impossible to tell which one was actually ranked higher. This is gonna be a common theme across most entries I talk about, but I'm not really surprised that Trust and Betrayal held the #1 spot at some point. Kenshin was already a beloved long-running shonen franchise, and Trust and Betrayal gave us the backstory that fans had been craving for so long. Though it did briefly fall behind again shortly after Death Note's finale, it quickly regained its spot. And as of August 16th, 2007, it became the first anime to score over a 9.0. Is what I would say, if not for the fact that at almost the exact same time, an anime film tied Trust and Betrayal for the #1 spot. That film being The Girl Who Leapt Through Time. This was Mamoru Hosoda's first film outing not tied to a major franchise, and considering his reputation nowadays, as well as what his other work at the time looked like, it's no wonder that he immediately hit it off strong. Just a little over a week later, we have the first records of MAL's combined anime rankings, and Trust and Betrayal still managed to hold #1. Though it did fall below a 9.0. By this point, 2007 is starting to draw to a close, and if you know anything about anime in 2007, then you know there's at least one other show that took the community by storm. After holding the #2 spot for over a month and slowly but steadily increasing in score, the #1 spot was finally relinquished on October 24th to none other than Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann, a hype-as-fuck modern mecha filled with an incredibly lovable and complex cast of characters and explosive animation courtesy of Hiroyuki Imaishi and Gainax. And there it would stay unchallenged for 16 months. At least as far as the record-keeping shows. There were certainly plenty of contenders that could have overtaken it. Code Geass R2, Aria the Origination, the proper second season of Hajime no Ippo, but it wouldn't be any of those that would dethrone the mecha giant. Instead, on February 9th, 2009, a new challenger seemingly out of nowhere and already on its 5th iteration would be the next number 1, that being the Garden of Sinners Movie 5 Paradox Spiral. I don't really know much about the Garden of Sinners, but I do know about Ufotable, and I know that Garden of Sinners was the first entry with the Ufotable aesthetic we know today. And along with its Type Moon pedigree, it's easy to see how it managed to rise up so quickly. Sometime in the next 5 months, Gurren Lagann would take back number 1, but it wouldn't be long before yet another contender of legendary status would rise to the top. On August 6th, the iconic OVA series Legend of the Galactic Heroes seized the throne, and would then continue to sit untouched on everyone's plan-to-watch list for the next 13 years. To be fair, 110 episodes of a series that wouldn't even be legally available for another whole decade is a bit of a difficult task to complete. But the diehard few who have reached the finish line are almost unanimous in their praises for this epic space opera. Unfortunately, the next 10 months of Mal's history have been lost to time, and considering how quickly the anime fandom was changing at this point, pretty much anything could have happened. For a history checkpoint, this was shortly after the time that Crunchyroll made the switch from illegal fan sub-site to legal streaming platform. The only thing we know for certain, however, is that on June 11th, 2010, the number 1 spot was held by The Disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya, clocking in at a staggering 9.13. It might seem like ancient history now, but the influence of the Haruhi TV series on the Western anime fandom of the mid-2000s was ever present. Haruhi was everywhere. And so it only seems fitting that the incredibly powerful movie entry briefly held the crown. At this point, we reach another month-and-a-half long history gap. Certainly not the longest we've seen so far, but this particular gap is probably the most unfortunate we've come across in this video because of what came next. Yep, it's the moment you've all been waiting for. On July 29th, 2010, we reached the first recorded instance in the history of MyAnimeList where the number 1 spot was held by Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, towering over the competition with a 9.16. Do I even need to say anything about Brotherhood at this point? Its reputation precedes it even outside the world of anime. The clever magic systems, intense political thrills, deep characterization, and phenomenal animation truly make it something special. No other series has had the word perfect ascribed to it nearly as much. And while that statement is certainly up for debate, its influence on anime fans is unmatched. And here it would stay in the number 1 spot for 9 months? Really? I was expecting like at least a year or two. What could have possibly dethroned it so quickly? Oh, it's Gintama. Yeah, that tracks. On April 22nd, 2011, the second season of Gintama would take number 1. Much like Legend of the Galactic Heroes, Gintama is another series with a reputation for being extremely long but incredibly good, and I can definitely vouch for that myself. Its fantastic mix of wacky comedy, hyped up shonen action, and truly heartfelt character writing made it the perfect niche shonen series, with the second season initially clocking in at a whopping 9.48. But as we all know, this would not be a position it would hold forever. Through a combination of numerous factors, the score for Gintama Season 2 slowly began to drop, while Brotherhood's began to rise. To its credit though, Gintama would not go down without a fight, and it even managed to briefly squeeze in Enchosen, a not quite third season, into the number 2 spot, dropping Brotherhood down to number 3. Eventually, however, Brotherhood regained the top spot on May 3rd, 2013, over 2 years later, giving Gintama Season 2 the record for the longest consecutive length holding the number 1 spot so far. As a brief aside, there was a very short period around February to March of 2011 where the top anime rankings appeared to be out of order in terms of overall rating. I can only speculate that Mal may have tried a different calculation system at this time where entries with more user ratings scaled higher than those with less, though this was very quickly abandoned in favor of something else. In any case, this is where Brotherhood began its domination in earnest. As the months and years passed, it sat atop the Azure throne unmatched, though there were occasionally a few challengers. The closest anything got to overtaking it in this time period was the Yorozuya Forever film because, again, it's Gintama, but even it never managed to crack the top. Meanwhile, Brotherhood's score continued to inch higher and higher, reaching its peak of 9.26 on October 15th, 2015. It wouldn't be until March 30th, 2016 that Brotherhood would briefly lose its throne for the first time in almost 3 years, thus beating the record previously held by Gintama Season 2. I'm sure 2016 is setting off some alarm bells for many of you, but slow your roll cause we ain't there yet. As here it would be yet another season of Gintama taking the lead, topping out at a 9.33. This time it was Season 4, which, again, is honestly not surprising at all since Season 4 contains both the Shogun Assassination and Farewell Shinsengumi arcs, which are considered by many Gintama fans to be the peak of the franchise. Of course, much like many of the entries from here on out, Gintama's reign would not last forever, with Brotherhood regaining the lead about 5 months later on August 19th. This would be one of Brotherhood's shortest stretches though, as on September 11th, 2016, the absolute mega hit film Your Name completely smashed past Brotherhood with a staggering 9.40. The combination of excitable characters, an endearing romance, and a fresh combination of as many tried and true tropes under the sun as they could cram in, along with some incredibly detailed and vibrant animation, had this film obliterating box office records left and right. And Your Name would hold the #1 spot for almost 4 months before it was replaced not by Brotherhood, but instead by, you guessed it, another season of Gintama. This time being Season 5 on January 8th, 2017, with a score of 9.49, thus pushing Brotherhood all the way down to number 3, though it would only be about 4 days before this new entry fell down to number 4 and Your Name was back on top. There it would rest comfortably for another 7 months until it was passed up on August 15th, not by Brotherhood, and not by another Gintama sequel, but instead by Owari Monogatari Season 2, which, at this point, was the 10th entry into the Monogatari franchise. Between its verbose and clever dialogue, complex character writing, and excessively stylized visuals, the Monogatari series had been slowly but surely acquiring more and more clout as the series went on, with Owari Season 2 being the big climax of what is known in the light novels as the final season, and so it seemed natural that it would have a chance at the top. The following 2 weeks might be one of the most tumultuous periods in the history of Mal's #1 spot, or at least by the standards we've witnessed so far. On August 20th, Your Name reclaimed #1, but was then usurped by Owari Season 2 on August 23rd, whereafter both were taken down by Brotherhood on August 28th. Quite an exciting turn of events, though it wouldn't be the last time we'd see such a struggle. The next #1 might be one of the briefest reigns in Mal's history. So brief, in fact, that it registered in the #1 spot before its highest score could be recorded. At some point on October 1st, the top spot fell once again to Gintama, this time with Season 6, also known as the Slip Arc, which is basically just a collection of one-off stories from the manga that the anime had skipped over. By October 3rd, however, Brotherhood was back on top, though I suspect it might have occurred the day before. Again, spotty records for this time period. Shortly thereafter, the following entry technically isn't recorded in the #1 spot, at least not on record, but on October 7th it briefly held a score of 9.29, putting it above Brotherhood. And that anime was... Pingu in the City. And, look, I'm pretty sure this one's just here for the meme. Now, I can't really prove that, but I will point out that it had only 267 ratings at the time, whereas Brotherhood had over 600,000. And this isn't the last time we'd see a very out-of-place entry take the #1 spot. In any case, Brotherhood was back on top 3 days later at the very latest, but on December 31st, it would be overtaken again, though in placement only and not in recorded score, by Overlord Season 2. And this is where we have to start digging into exactly how MyAnimeList works. When you're looking at that big list of anime on the rankings page, it shows you a corresponding number of how many people have that anime on their lists. However, that does not mean that that's the number of people who have scored that anime. It's not even the number of people who have completed it. That's just the grand total of entries across all watching, completed, on hold, dropped, and plan to watch lists that the entry appears on. So when I tell you that Overlord Season 2 was on over 86,000 lists at the time, the vast majority of those were likely plan to watch entries since the anime technically hadn't started airing yet. I say technically because, well, let me explain. As it exists today, the Overlord Season 2 entry on MAL lists its start date as January 9th, 2018, which I corroborated with its Wikipedia entry. However, when you view it through the Wayback Machine, it has a start date on MAL of December 17th, 2017. My initial instinct was that it had an early episode 1 screening, but I can't find any evidence of that anywhere. If anyone has the answer to what happened here, please let me know in the comments, but I can only assume that this was some kind of data entry error that had the series premiere go live on the site earlier than it was supposed to. That doesn't really answer why it immediately jumped to #1 though, and for that, we must continue a bit further down the timeline. Brotherhood was back on top by January 4th, 2018, but then a series of events that I can only describe as buck wild horse shit happened. On January 6th, Cardcaptor Sakura Clear Card jumped to #1 with a 9.30. And the very next day, it was overtaken by Gintama Silver Soul with a fucking 9.50, the highest score in MAL's recorded history to date. But Brotherhood rose back up 4 days after that. And it's at this point that we need to talk about how MAL's score data is tabulated. Right now, I could go on a page on MAL for an anime that hasn't started airing yet, list it as completed, and give it a score. But MAL won't actually record that score in the rankings data because that's very obviously just data manipulation. However, when that series officially starts airing, that score gets added to the data because the series is now live. So people who immediately dropped a high rating on a sequel to a show they loved as soon as the air date hit, or even prematurely rated it before it even began, caused the data to be manipulated. With this, we have an easy explanation for why all these sequels immediately jump to #1 the day they air, before very quickly falling off again. This also nearly happened again with Season 2 of The Disastrous Life of Psyche K a few days later, and Steins Gate Zero at the beginning of April. But they only managed to rise to #4 and #3 respectively. Unfortunately, after these early incidences, 2018 really wasn't that interesting a year. Honestly, the most engaging part of the research for this time period became the constant back and forth between Hunter x Hunter 2011 and Legend of the Galactic Heroes for the #5 spot. This is the era where it felt like the very top of the MAL rankings was mostly set in stone, aside from very minor shifts here and there. Even the scores themselves don't change all that much in either direction. However, this monotony would come to an abrupt halt near the end of April 2019, as a combination of the sequel effect and premature ratings led a new entry to attack the throne. you see that I used attack because the show is called Attack on Titan. Immediately upon its release, Attack on Titan Season 3 Part 2 claimed the number 2 spot with a 9.17, the highest score in the franchise's history so far, though it would quickly fall back down over the next couple days. Though it wouldn't be long before it threatened Brotherhood's throne once again, rising back up to number 2 on June 4th and steadily increasing in score as its final month of broadcast went on, reaching as high as a 9.23 on July 1st, just 100th shy of tying Brotherhood, before falling back down again. Attack on Titan is another one of those series where I really don't need to explain why it's so far up the list. Its dominance of the anime landscape over the past 10 years with its gritty setting, intricate political scheming, and high-octane action sequences has been, in a word, inescapable. Now, the pattern of scores rapidly rising to the top shortly after a final episode and then falling off just as quickly is pretty well documented at this point, so it's not surprising that this entry eventually fell off as well. However, and this is purely my opinion based on how I've seen certain people act, I have no doubt that Season 3 Part 2 would have eclipsed Brotherhood if not for a particular phenomenon that occurs when these circumstances arise. You see, over the years, Brotherhood fans have developed what one might call a sense of pride in having that number 1 spot, and so any threat to that title is met with hostility and, allegedly, score manipulation. Of course, Brotherhood fans aren't the only ones not playing fair. On August 2nd, Brotherhood's score would take a mysterious dip, dropping from a 9.24 to a 9.10, bringing it all the way down to 6th place and leaving Attack on Titan at number 1. And I don't think we need to speculate that much on who was responsible for this. In any case, Attack on Titan Season 3 Part 2 held the number 1 spot until August 9th, when its gradual score decrease allowed none other than Steins Gate to finally rise to the top. It feels weird getting all the way to 2019 without talking about this series, but in terms of male rankings, Steins Gate was very much an always the bridesmaid, never the bride scenario, constantly living in Brotherhood's shadow until all this score fuckery started happening. But its place near the top is certainly not without merit. A time travel thriller filled with endearing characters and as much of a technical look at the mechanics of time travel as you can get makes this a truly special series. Though unfortunately it only held number 1 for a single day, with Brotherhood rising back up to its usual 9.24 the next day, presumably after Mal intervened on account of the score manipulation. Speaking of score manipulation, while I don't give that much focus to anime that almost claim the number 1 spot, this next entry is so blatant in how its score was manipulated that I have to talk about it. On February 5th, 2020, the AniTuber Nuxtaku made a video about the at the time currently airing Interspecies Reviewers, an ecchi title that, in all honesty, is basically porn and was so explicit that TV stations in Japan were pulling it from the broadcast schedule. Mostly because the anime was vastly more explicit than the manga and the TV stations had not anticipated this. See Cartoon Cypher's video on this for more information. In Nux's video, he called on his fans to push the series to the number 1 spot on Mal. Based on data pulled from Social Blade, Nux had a little over 1 million subscribers at the time, so you can imagine what effect this would have on Mal data if even a fraction of his fans went along with this scheme. The very next day, Interspecies Reviewers reached the number 2 spot with a 9.16 and stayed there for at least the next 2 days, though I couldn't find any record of it actually claiming the number 1 spot. Very shortly after this, Mal took direct action to remove fraudulent scores, with the series now sitting significantly lower in the rankings. Now, I actually do like Interspecies Reviewers quite a bit. It was one of my favorite anime of 2020, and I even have the steelbook for it. It's a very fun series. But there is absolutely no way this series would have come anywhere close to number 1, or even the top 50 for that matter, without Nux sending in his legion of fans to bolster its reputation. Jumping forward to December, Attack on Titan would make an assault on the throne once again. This time with the deceptively titled Final Season, though it only managed to tie Brotherhood on its premiere date before falling back down after the premature ratings wore off. However, it is worth noting that over the past 2 years, Brotherhood's score has very slowly but steadily fallen. Its peak was a 9.26 back in October 2015, but by the start of 2021, it had dropped to 9.21. The gap between Brotherhood and the rest of the list was becoming narrower, meaning that those wishing to claim the number 1 spot might have an easier try at it going forward. The first instance of this would be when Attack on Titan the Final Season returned to number 2, steadily growing in score through the back half of January until it finally passed Brotherhood, which had now dropped to a 9.20 on February 5th, 2021. Though it would only remain there for half a day before falling back to number 2, with the speed of this score drop over the next couple days being suspicious to say the least. It would again reclaim number 1 after the season finale on March 28th, before falling back down again the next day, and by this time Brotherhood's score drop was slowly increasing in speed, having already fallen to a 9.18 by this time. Then, after falling further to a 9.17 in mid-June, it would be overtaken by Fruits Basket the Final on June 28th. For the Western anime fandom, Fruits Basket is essentially the seminal shoujo romance anime, and with the remake being a complete adaptation of the source material, it's no surprise that this climactic entry managed to reach number 1, though it would only hold the spot for 2 days before instantly falling almost 1/10 of a point. Less than 2 months later, on August 19th, we would see Gintama reclaim number 1 for the final time with Gintama the Final. By this point, Brotherhood's score had decreased again to a 9.16, allowing Gintama to maintain the throne for a little over 2 weeks until September 2nd, the longest consecutive non-Brotherhood reign since Your Name back in 2016. It is also quite curious that the day it fell off of number 1, it dropped by a whole 0.23, but we'd be here all day if we kept speculating which trade-offs were legitimate and which were manipulated. At the end of November, Brotherhood's score would drop again to a 9.15, and by early February 2022, yet another sequel series would rise to the top, that being Attack on Titan the Final Season Part 2, which would spend almost an entire week tied with Brotherhood before finally claiming number 1 on February 14th. Though it would fall back down to number 2 the next day, then retake number 1 again the day after that, before falling off again. Now, you might have picked up on this by now, but most of the time periods when shows rise to the top are right after the start or end of their broadcasts. But this wasn't the case with Final Season Part 2. However, if I told you that the score shot up drastically after episode 5, From You 2,000 Years Ago, and claimed the top spot the day of episode 6, Thaw, then those who have seen the show probably understand why this time period was its hotspot. Despite the patterns we've seen so far, Final Season Part 2 would not rally after its last episode, but would instead drop dramatically, though that doesn't mean Brotherhood was safe for the time being, as it would soon be overtaken by another series in the upcoming spring season. Bringing it back full circle to where we started, Season 3 of Kaguya-sama Love is War quickly rose from the lower teens all the way up to number 1 on June 25th after the airing of its final episode, eventually topping out at a 9.17, 4/100ths of a point ahead of Brotherhood. It's difficult for me to succinctly explain the appeal of Kaguya-sama, which is why I made a whole video about it about a week ago, but the clever integration of its premise into the age-old rom-com trope of never actually confessing, quick-witted and bombastic humor, and possibly the most ambitious, healthy, and talented production from all of 2022 makes this series, Season 3 in particular, a true standout not just for anime rom-coms, but for anime in general. It's one of those series where it feels unreal how good it is, and the score reflects that quality accordingly. Of course, much like every title before it, Kaguya's reign would not last, though it did manage to stay at number 1 for over a month, and it still managed to briefly float to the top again on August 1st and 4th. It even took all the way until September 2nd for it to drop a single hundredth below Brotherhood. This is what makes Kaguya-sama stand out from all the other seasonal contenders before it. Rather than shooting up to the top and then quickly falling by the wayside, Kaguya has established its place at the summit. It has staying power. I wrote almost everything in this script up to right now back at the end of August, and Kaguya is still right up there, and its time on the throne was a massive spectacle, as data provided by the Wayback Machine shows that the months following Kaguya-sama's reign marked the most recorded period in the history of MyAnimeList's top rankings. This was an event, both because Kaguya-sama is an insanely popular show, and because the attention drawn to what holds the number 1 spot has reached a fever pitch. If it wasn't obvious enough already, the Kaguya-sama event was the main reason I decided to put this video together. And if nothing else had happened for the rest of the year, I feel like that would have been a more than strong enough ending for this video. However, there were still 4 months left in the year by the time I got to this point in the script, which means there are still plenty of surprises and upsets left in store, as the fall 2022 season had already made a name for itself before the season even started, with nearly a dozen hotly anticipated titles gracing the airwaves. On October 10th, the premiere of Bleach: The Thousand-Year Blood War would immediately have its Mal entry shooting up to the top with an initial score of 9.26, and it would maintain that spot for almost 3 days. Being one of the big 3, a historic title within the Western anime community that I also did a very long video on, Bleach has always been massively popular despite many of the criticisms people have made towards its anime adaptation. It was also the only one of the big 3 to have its adaptation stop before it reached the end of the manga. And that's where this new season comes into play, adapting the final arc and bringing an end to Bleach's story in anime form. So an immense amount of hype was already pre-baked into this adaptation. On top of that, this new season is being handled by director Tomohisa Taguchi, most known for his anime original series Akudama Drive and the most recent Digimon movie Last Evolution Kizuna, both of which are bursting at the seams with Taguchi's explosive stylizations, especially when it comes to color direction, and he doesn't seem to be falling off to any degree with this new Bleach series. With the final arc being split into 4 different anime entries over the next 2 years, I expect it to be competing with Brotherhood for the top spot multiple times in the near future. Meanwhile, on October 11th, we saw yet another series leapfrog over Brotherhood, though we unfortunately don't have its peak score recorded, and that series was none other than Chainsaw Man. If you've somehow managed to go this long in the anime and manga community without hearing about Chainsaw Man, A, please tell me what rock you're hiding under because I'd love to join you so I can avoid some spoilers, and B, Chainsaw Man has been fucking inescapable since around halfway through Part 1's manga serialization. The insanely intense action and complex character writing draped in a B-movie aesthetic have earned it an esteemed place within the manga canon, as well as a die-hard, though admittedly unhinged and immensely annoying fanbase unlike any I've seen from this community in a very long time. And with its production being handled by some of the strongest talents in the industry right now, it's no wonder that it managed to sneak past Brotherhood, if only for half a day. Bleach would overtake Brotherhood again on November 22nd, then drop to a tie on November 30th, before falling below it again on December 5th, only to make yet another resurgence upon its finale on December 26th, shooting all the way up to a 9.23. Chainsaw Man only managed to just barely broach the top 25 by the time it ended, and though it's not super necessary to this discussion, I do want to point out the staggering success of Bocchi the Rock, which rose all the way up to the number 12 spot after its finale with a 9.02, which might be the highest rating that a slice of life series has ever achieved, a moniker that Bocchi has most definitely earned with its explosively creative animation and endearing characters. And that's where we end the year. Bleach managed to hold the throne for a whole week after its finale and stand tall as the top-ranked anime at the start of 2023. Not exactly a surprise by any stretch, but momentous to say the least. At the end of all of this, I must admit that the history of Mal's #1 anime has been a lot more interesting to dive into than I expected. I had not planned on writing over 6,500 words about this, but it has been a thoroughly entertaining exercise, if a bit laborious. As for where everything goes from here, while it's still very likely that Bleach will drop down the rankings as the weeks go by, I also think it's inevitable that Brotherhood will eventually fall from #1 for good. Whether it's another season of the 1,000-Year Blood War, or something entirely new that comes completely out of nowhere, Brotherhood will eventually fall. Nothing in this community is permanent other than our love for the medium. And so long as artists keep creating new and exciting works, the battle for what will sit at the top of an arbitrary ratings aggregate website will continue. One can only hope that whatever claims #1 is something that truly represents what makes anime so amazing. Special thanks to Rourke Tenjoin, Chris Adili, Ryan Johnson, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.